Welcome to Radio Adyashanti, and I'm Adya, and I want to welcome everyone from, well, literally all around the world who listen to this program and tune in and write me emails and send me letters about what they're getting from this program. So I want to make sure that everyone feels welcome wherever you might be. Here on the west coast of California at 6 o'clock. At other places, it could be the middle of the night. For some people, it's early in the morning, and others, it's late in the evening. So for wherever you are, welcome to this program, to this, really what we create each time we meet together like this is a virtual Sangha, a virtual spiritual community, you might say. And this program is really dedicated to exploring the deepest truth within our being, within existence. And that's really what I'm here for. That's what my teaching is dedicated to, and that's what I encourage for everybody who might tune in to take a moment to put aside the trivialities of life, put aside the small things, you might say, for a few moments, and really look deeply into the nature of our own existence, into the nature of that which is sacred and timeless and whole. In other words, spirituality is really a means that we address the deepest yearning that's really in the heart of all beings, whether they think of themselves as spiritual or not. Really, all beings in their own unique ways yearn for peace, for happiness, yearn for home, yearn for a deep sense of connectedness. And that's what we're here for. That's what this program is for. For those who may be listening for the first time, I want to remind you that this is a call-in program, so you can call in, and the numbers are on your screen. But please wait until I open the phone lines. I'll tell you a little later in the program when they open up. If you call too soon, they just won't be answered. So just wait, and I'll let you know when we open the phone lines up, and I welcome your questions. I wanted to start out this evening. It's really sort of a response to one of the emails I got. I won't read the particular question, but I wanted to respond to it in a way, and I thought to open the program this evening, this might be a good place to start. And really it's sort of a very brief, you might say, very brief summary of what the spiritual movement is. You could call it the spiritual path, but I like to think of it more like an internal movement inside yourself, more than a path that one pursues and hopes to arrive somewhere at some point in time. And we all start, in one sense, in this path in the visible world around us, the world of manifestation, what we take in through our five senses. And one of the metaphors I like to use are images that I find helpful is the image of a tree. And the whole manifest world are just the leaves on the tree. It's the exterior view that our senses pick up. And then there's the branches, and the branches are really our senses themselves, our sense of sight and sound and taste and touch. And our senses are what register this world around us, are what take it in. It's these senses are that which life or consciousness uses to sense itself, to contact with the visible world. And so in many spiritual traditions, actually, one's taught how to use their senses. In other words, to pay attention to your sense of sight and sound and taste and touch and feeling. Many of the spiritual practices are various ways of utilizing your senses. And really one of the reasons for this is to simply get us out of our minds, to get us out of our obsession with thinking and imagination. And one of the quickest ways to do that is to connect with your senses, what your senses take in. Now, our senses also arise out of consciousness. And in this metaphor of this tree, consciousness would be likened to the trunk of the tree. So consciousness is that which recognizes what comes in from the senses, and also recognizes what doesn't come in from the senses too. We can talk about that a little later. But consciousness is that awareness that takes everything in, that notices everything, every experience that ever happens. It's taken in through the senses and recognized by consciousness itself. So in this moment, as we're together, your sense of hearing is taking in my voice right now. For those of you who are utilizing the video feed, then you also can see me at this moment and your sense of sight. But senses without consciousness wouldn't mean much. So consciousness is sort of the trunk of this tree of existence. And at the very, very root of existence is what I call the primordial void. The primordial void isn't something that can be easily described, actually, because it's beyond all description. The closest that I ever come to describing it is just to call it a sort of pure potential. A pure potential before any of that potential has been realized, has been made manifest. And in that sense, it's void because absolutely nothing has arisen from it. And really the process of our coming back to ourselves, coming back home, our spiritual awakening, is coming back to the root of existence, coming from the manifest world back through the gate of the senses into consciousness. And when we come into consciousness deeply, then that consciousness, its natural capacity for self-recognition, it recognizes itself. That capacity it has becomes realized, and when the capacity consciousness has to recognize itself to become realized, then that's a moment of spiritual awakening, in a sense. It's a shift in consciousness. Actually, it's a shift away from what consciousness takes in through the senses to consciousness itself. So consciousness recognizes itself. You could also say spirit. Spirit recognizes itself. And that's one level of spiritual awakening. And ultimately, one even goes deeper than that to this primordial void, to the root from which existence comes, the first manifestation of existence being consciousness. And when we come back to our real deepest, ultimate nature, the ultimate reality of what we are, of what everything is, it's really, this is something that's, in a sense, beyond consciousness. It is the root of existence. It's this primordial void. And, of course, in spirituality, as I often like to explain it, it's really a backward step. It's a step from appearances, whether it's appearance in what we see, taste, touch, and feel around us, or it's the appearance inside, primarily in our minds, because those are appearances too, what we think, what we imagine, the conclusions we make. And coming back from those conclusions, coming back from the world of appearances, stepping back into yourself. And then you step back into yourself through your senses, through paying attention to your senses. And then you notice, then you come back to this consciousness, which is the consciousness that's functioning through the senses, that's conscious of the senses, back to the primordial void. But spirituality isn't simply a process of taking the backward step of a return. Once we've fully returned, then the process of going back out ensues again, but it happens from a conscious way. So the primordial void births itself as consciousness into this, and then the senses, and then the perceived world. Once we've returned to the void in a very conscious way, then we can actually accomplish this return, this natural and spontaneous return to the world, as it were, without getting lost, without getting overly identified in what consciousness is conscious of, and identified with what the senses pick up. Because all human beings have the experience of being born, having senses, having consciousness, and then bit by bit by bit we start to become identified with what we imagine, what we think, who we think we are, what we think we are, what we're told about ourselves, what we're told about the world and God and all the rest. We become identified with that, and then we seek home again. We seek some deep existential resolution. And so, as I said, spirituality is in one sense primarily a return, but it's not a return where you stay, but it's a return back to the primordial void, and then from the primordial void back into the world. And ultimately these two are kind of like breathing. Both are happening simultaneously. This return in to the void and this return from the void back to the world that's perceived by our senses. And this is sort of a very, very quick, rudimentary way of looking at the spiritual journey, you could say. But I often find that to make spiritual teachings simple actually makes them powerful. If it's very, very complex, it may seem very enticing, very interesting, but it's often not very powerful. So I like to present these teachings as a simple way as I can, because then they have a power. Then each person is invited to look within themselves and find out what they mean for themselves. So you undertake them and you find out what they mean for you. But this comes out of a question where someone was talking about the void. And one of the things I think is really, really quite necessary to understand is, again, the idea is not to return simply back to consciousness and then to the primordial void as an endpoint. Primordial void or consciousness, even, it's neither one of them are endpoints. It's not a place we stay and set up camp and create a whole new sort of identity around and hold on, because if you do, you find that you start not functioning so well in the world, because you literally retrieve your life force from the world around you, and also ultimately from your own body and mind. And if you retreat enough, then it becomes very difficult for life to live through you in a wise and balanced way. But when you come back to your root of the primordial void, and then it naturally and spontaneously starts to return. The void moves out into consciousness, the senses, and then the world that we perceive around us. Once this sort of circle happens, then we've found the truth of who we are, both essentially and relatively, and life can continue this sort of circular, unified expression that it has of return in and return back out. And like I said, it becomes like breathing. Now, of course, for many, many people, the return back to their real essence itself has its own challenges, and that's where I find so many people are actually to this day. A lot, even people who've awakened, many of them, probably most of them, have awakened as consciousness itself, which is amazing and very, very profound. And yet, if you try to hold on to that, two things happen. If you try to hold on to that and think that that's simply an endpoint, then, number one, you don't really fully allow yourself to return to the void. And also, you don't allow the void to fully return back into life. So wherever we stop, we tend to get stuck. And to me, spirituality is primarily about unstucking oneself, getting yourself so you're not stuck, so you're not fixated. You're not fixated in the outside world. You're not fixated in your mind and what you think and what you imagine and what you believe. And you're not fixated on inner experiences of emptiness or even the primordial void. That you're really a free being is a being that's not stuck on any level of existence. But they're actually freed up. All these are freed up so that they kind of flow as a unified whole. Because when I talk about these, it's as if they're different things. But it's why I like to use the image of a tree, because a tree is one thing. The leaves, the branches, the trunk, the roots. It's one. They all go together to make one tree. You can't actually take one to the exclusion of the other. There isn't roots that are totally separate from a trunk, or a trunk that's totally separate from branches, and so on. It's actually a unified whole, even though when it's described it might seem like very distinct and different things. But the more I go around and teach and the more people I talk to, I find that really there's those who are really in the process of awakening to themselves as this consciousness. Sometimes there's those who've awoken to this primordial void. And then there's also those who've gone that deep and are now, their next phase is actually to come back out of even attachment to that void or attachment to consciousness and let this existence flow back out. And it's sort of an overflow of life experiencing itself. And in that, there's really nowhere to get stuck. There's nothing to grasp hold of. There's nothing to hide behind. But there's one aspect of this that I want to also touch upon this evening, and that is something that I find very, very important, and is that it's really useful to look at where your attention is rooted, what it roots itself in, which means what is it, not only what does it attach to, but literally where is it living most of the time. And really a lot of spirituality is rooting our experience back to its source. So ultimately all experience gets rooted back first into consciousness. And by rooted I mean you tracing experience back to its source. So if there's a thought, you trace the thought from where it came. And when you trace a thought back to where it came, it comes from consciousness, from a totally thoughtless, awake space. And when you trace consciousness back to its source is this primordial void. But initially, spirituality is all about tracing back what we take in through our senses back into consciousness, to really root experience into consciousness, root thought into consciousness, root experience, root feeling, emotion. If our experience is not rooted within consciousness and then ultimately in the void, what ends up, you end up very top-heavy, very topsy-turvy. So if you have a thought, immediately your consciousness identifies with the thought. It gets carried away with the thought in a trance state, or a feeling that you have, or an experience. Or the outside world, consciousness just gets completely lost. It loses its root. And of course, as soon as consciousness has lost its root or its source, it will feel this yearning, this quite natural yearning to come back to its source, to stay connected, in other words. And this is what it means to sort of root one's experience back into consciousness, back into this conscious, awake stillness. And once that helps one to awaken. And then even that consciousness, you find it's also rooted into this sort of primordial void. Sometimes it may be called the Godhead, the primordial void, almost into non-existence, you might say. Hard to find a word for the primordial void, but that's what I call it. And when all of your experience becomes rooted in the void, then whatever happens doesn't keep all of your attention, doesn't just get lost in the next thought that comes up, in the next belief pattern, in the next assumption. It stays rooted, even though you're connecting with the world. You're connecting even with the world of thought and ideas and all of that we all use in our day-to-day lives to operate, that life uses to operate. But we do so in such a way that we spontaneously stay connected to our source, that which is unmoving, unborn, and undying. And only that root, the root of existence, which is unborn, undying, and uncreated, knows that everything in creation, everything we see, taste, touch, and feel is an expression of the unexpressible void. Only from that depth of experience do we know that everything, literally everything, is an expression of that pure potential, of that primordial void. And so naturally there's a rootedness. By rooting I also mean there's, if you know, like a sailboat has ballast, it has this deep weight that is in the ballast of the boat. It runs in the center of the boat, usually underneath the level of the water, and it keeps the boat from toppling over when a wind hits it. If it didn't have any deep centered weight, a wave, or not a wave, but a wind would just come, grab the sail, and could literally just knock the boat over. So there's this ballast, there's weight in the center of most any ocean-going vessel that helps it to remain straight, to not get tipped over. And spiritually speaking, to root experience back into consciousness, and then consciousness in the void, give you sort of this ballast, this way in which you don't get just taken away or pushed over by the next experience, that you always stay connected with the source, with the essence of your being. And this is something that even for people who have had deep awakenings, it doesn't necessarily mean in and of itself that they are able just to stay rooted in it. And many people find that their awakening, the moments of clarity kind of come and go, and are sometimes dependent on what they think, what they feel, the situations in their life, etc. But the more rooted we become within consciousness, and again, how one becomes rooted is to trace each experience that comes in from the senses to its source. So each thought gets traced back into the thoughtless. Each sound gets traced back into silence. Each taste gets followed backwards into that which is not a taste, and so on. And by doing that, you really kind of create this rooted ability to stay very awake, to stay in a very, very clear space, regardless of what may be happening around you. And at some point, this happens naturally. Of course, we all are essentially already rooted into existence. I mean, everything that I'm talking about is already happening. It's just what you're really doing is becoming more and more aware of it, more cognizant of it. You're bringing more awareness to it. And that makes all the difference, because something may be functioning, but if you don't know it's functioning, if there's no awareness of it, then it's as if it's not functioning. So it's very useful to be conscious of what's happening. And when all your experience gets rooted into consciousness, into that inner stillness and silence, and then stillness gets rooted into this primordial void, then you'll find this great inner spiritual stability. And then once it's rooted, then there's a flowing back out. In the Zen tradition, one of the images that's used to depict the fully enlightened sage is the sage is walking back off the mountaintop, symbolizing enlightenment, walking back off the mountaintop with a staff in his hand and a bag of goodies over his shoulder, and he's walking right back into the world. And this is really what I'm talking about, whereas our deepest, truest nature isn't trying to hide in consciousness or in this sort of primordial void, but eventually it has this return back to life, back to existence, back to the fullness of what it means to be alive. And except now it's done in a conscious way, which makes all the difference in the world. To really come back into life, into a full engagement with life in a conscious way makes all the difference. It's the difference between freedom and peace and happiness and its opposite, suffering, confusion, all the various ways we can be in suffering and confused. So I wanted to just start the program out with that very, very brief idea, but if you really put some of it to practical use, if you actually really do trace a thought into the thoughtless and trace a feeling into that which isn't a feeling, and trace and to notice that everything you see through your eyes, everything you see is actually being seen by a consciousness that you can't see. And by bringing awareness to that, by noticing it, you're actually rooting your experience back to its source, into a depth. And by doing that, you actually, number one, you can awaken to what you are, and you can also become very deeply rooted in your own essence and your own source, so that the next thing that comes along in life just doesn't knock you off balance all the time.